Day 10. Day 10 started pretty much like every day did now. After everyone had their individual devotion time, we slowly assembled under the pavilion for prayer time and a group devotional, usually led by Pastor or Aaron. Today, after that was over, the men went over and sat at the table. We talked about what we'd found at the middle school yesterday, and the very real possibility of needing to bug out in a hurry. Now, nobody relished the idea of leaving the church, but we all recognized it might become necessary at some point. We figured out how many seats we needed in the bus for everyone, and accounted for 3 or 4 extra. We decided we would remove the rest and load as much of the food and supplies as we could onto the bus. We topped off the gas and put the remaining cans on the roof rack, just about enough to fill it again. The power wagon was topped off as well, with about 8 gallons left in 2 cans that we secured into the back. That accounted for all our stored gas. Travel with the power wagon would be emergency only now. Steve and Richie stripped some angle iron and channel iron from the outdoor condensing units where they were used to support piping and electrical gear. They would use it to assemble a mount for the M60 in the back of the power wagon. They got some PVC piping as well from an old tent setup that the church used for outdoor events, and they installed it in the bed of the truck. They covered it with one of the canvas tarps we retrieved from Greg's house to conceal the M60. We would run this as the support vehicle for the bus should we need to bug out. As all this was going on, Greg, who was cutting up some of the PVC piping out in the back lot, whistled to get our attention. When I looked up, he pointed to the trail that leads out back to the power line. There were 3 people on mountain bikes coming out of the woods. Now, Richie was a member of Sportsman's Guide gear catalog. He found these string charges. They made noise equal to somewhere between a firecracker and an M80 when they were tripped. They were on an 18-inch string and set off when pulled apart. He purchased about 300 of them when we were prepping. They're actually fairly inexpensive. He had set them up in various spots along our perimeter by attaching them to longer cordage and running them between 2 trees. When the bikes rode through the trail into the back lot, they rode through one of the cords and set one off, and this alerted Greg. We saw immediately that it was Mrs. Timothy and her 2 sons, David, age 20, and Joshua, age 18. They were members of our church, and Mr. Timothy was a deacon here as well. Both boys had been off attending Bible college, David at Midwestern in Michigan and Joshua at West State in California. Both happened to be home, attending their grandmother's funeral when the EMP went off. Their dad, Neil, was not with them. We saw that Mrs. Timothy was bleeding pretty badly from her right arm, and when she saw us, she collapsed over and fell onto the ground. Callie ran immediately down to get Jolie, as we ran over to her and the boys. As Pastor and Richie helped carry her down to where we set up the infirmary, David told Greg and I how they had come to be there. He said they had sheltered in place at home for 4 days after the EMP went off, until all their food and water were nearly gone. With no working plan in place, Neil decided last minute on a desperate plan to bicycle to the church, in hopes of finding someone or something in the way of supplies. They packed what little food they had left in a backpack and filled 2 canteens with their remaining water. He told us that none of them had eaten now in 2 days, and the water they had in the canteen was nearly gone. They also told us the terrible news. Their dad, Neil, had been killed by one of 2 armed men they encountered on the way there. Now, they lived about 2 miles from a road that the same power line crossed, and knew that if they could make it there, they would have a good chance of getting along the power line all the way to where it runs behind the church. Neil and his sons had dirt bikes, and they had actually made the trip before. The dirt bikes were useless now because of the EMP, so they resorted to the mountain bikes. Just before leaving the road to enter the power line trail, they encountered 2 men attempting to clean out what was left inside a trash convenience store. When the men saw the Timothys, they stopped them, attempted to steal the meager supplies that they had managed to bring with them. Neil had a Smith & Wesson M&P 9mm with only one mag. 10 shots was all he had. When one of the men grabbed his wife and pulled her off the bike, Neil seized his opportunity to pull his sidearm and fired point blank into the man's head, killing him instantly with the first shot. As he turned to fire at the second man, he was shot 3 times, in the chest and in the abdomen, as the other man was ready and fired first. He lined up the boys and Catherine, Neil's wife, on their knees beside Neil's body. As he walked behind them, trying to decide which one to execute first, Catherine spun around in a desperate attempt to knock the man down. As she did, he fired 3 times, hitting her twice, once in the left shoulder and once in the arm. As she fell back, Joshua sprung up with a rock in his hand and struck the man in the head with the rock as hard as he possibly could. The man fell to the ground. Before anyone could react, Catherine picked up Neil's gun and fired the remaining 9 shots into the man as he lay unconscious and bleeding. They spent the next 4 days on the power line trying to get here. Jolie had given Catherine something for her pain and cleaned out her wounds. She assessed the damage and reported that the shot to the arm had gone clean through and had not seemed to do any significant damage. The shot to the shoulder, however, had no exit wound. The bullet was lodged somewhere inside her shoulder. It had been festering now for 4 days and was badly infected as well. Jolie cleaned it out as best she could. When alone with Richie and I, she confided that she lacked the confidence to effectively treat Catherine. She said she couldn't see the bullet and didn't want to poke around blindly with the infection present. She also said that she has some antibiotics, but it would take a few days for the infection to subside, if it did at all. And Catherine had lost a lot of blood and had a fever from the infection. Jolie confided in us that she did not believe Catherine to be likely to survive. Richie comforted his daughter and assured her that she was, in fact, the only chance Catherine did have for survival. That she simply had to do her best to treat Catherine. He told her that although he knew she lacked the formal training to perform surgery and wasn't even certified as a nurse yet, we still were blessed to have her with us, and that she could do what was necessary. He put his arm around her as she cried on his shoulder. These were people Jolie grew up with. She was in the teen and youth group with David and Joshua. They were all members of our church family. They weren't strangers to her. She loved them. She couldn't bear the thought of letting them down. What enormous responsibility this 19-year-old young lady just had thrust upon her. Richie had tears in his eyes as well, bearing the burden of his daughter's heart. Pastor came in, prayed over Catherine, and prayed with Jolie. He told her, "I know this is hard, kiddo. Just do your best." We all left. Jolie asked that Linda go in to assist. In many ways, Linda was like a mother to Jolie. I think she felt secure having her there. Shortly after, Jolie decided to give Catherine a blood transfusion because she had lost so much. When we were prepping, Steve, Richie, and myself recorded our blood types and the types of our family as well. As it turned out, Aaron and Callie had done the same. Callie was a match for Catherine and agreed to let Jolie take blood for Catherine. Jolie said she wanted to give her a pint today and a pint tomorrow and wait and see what happened with the infection. Meanwhile, outside, there was a lot going on in camp. Lee was monitoring the ham radio and the CB as well. Callie and Sadie were cooking black beans and rice. Pastor and Aaron were hauling water from the spring and gathering sticks for the rocket stove. Also, we were still preparing the truck and the bus for bug out. Out and back, Steve and Greg were training David and Joshua how to safely and effectively use the various firearms we had available. David now had his dad's 9mm. We gave him 100 rounds of ammo for it and told him to keep it with him at all times. We also gave Josh an old 12 gauge that Aaron had and a box of double-aught buck to go with it and told him the same thing. They were now part of the camp security team. After we had black beans and rice with diced tomatoes over them for lunch, and everyone returned to their assigned tasks, Greg and I geared up for a hike to our friend the farmer's house to check on them and fill them in on what we'd found at the middle school yesterday. When we reached the road, we hit the woods in our usual formation and made our way toward the farm. Coming up along the driveway, we announced ourselves, and the farmer's neighbor that he took in the other day greeted us at the door with a shotgun. Once inside, we filled them in on the FEMA camp at the school. We let them know that when the time came to bug out, they would be welcome to go with us. I had a lot in the middle of nowhere in Vermont, and that would be our backup location. I had a small cabin there and limited supplies buried around. The cabin would not house all of us, but between it and the bus, we could manage until shelters could be built. He thanked us, and he told us he had hoped it would not be necessary. I told him, that makes two of us, my friend. But when you see that bus coming up the driveway, be ready to roll. Walking in the woods served us well. Greg heard them first and whistled ahead. We both stopped where we were and ducked behind trees near us. They drove by without even suspecting we were there. 3 Jeeps with 4 men in each, security force on their jackets in big white letters. At least they were heading in the opposite direction of the church. For now, anyway. We were feeling a little vulnerable. We decided not to have a fire that evening. It was pretty chilly out, so we assembled in Aaron and Callie's house, decided to burn some propane and run the space heater for an hour or so before going to bed and burrowing under a mountain of blankets to keep warm. In a small room down in the nursery was the bed where Catherine lay. Smaller space heater running to keep her warm. It was a little Mr. Buddy heater that we had, and it used very little fuel. We would run it all night. David took first watch in the tower. Now, with David and Josh helping with security, we would all get a night regularly when we would not have to do tower duty at all. Tonight was my night. It felt good to sleep for 7 hours straight at one time. Thank you all for watching. God bless you. Please like and subscribe to the channel.